hello. My name is the son they erased, quietly, in public, at my mother's funeral. That day, while her casket was still open, my brother stood up and announced he'd sell our family farm to cover his gambling debt. $650,000. My father nodded, then looked at me and said, "You can find somewhere else to live." No one argued. No one defended me. Relatives stared at the floor like silence was easier than truth. What they didn't know, what they never saw coming, was that my mother had been planning for this moment for 13 years. And when the lawyer finally spoke, the room went dead quiet, because the farm wasn't what was about to be lost. I arrived at my mother's funeral already hollowed out, like something essential had been taken from me long before the service ever began. The church doors were open, but the air inside felt sealed shut. Wooden pews creaked under shifting weight. Programs lay folded and untouched, their edges curling slightly in the late morning light. Dust floated through the narrow beams coming in from the stained glass windows, moving slowly, as if even the air understood this wasn't a day to rush. People I had known my entire life were there. Neighbors, relatives, old family friends. Faces I'd once trusted. Yet one by one, their eyes slid past me. Not hostile, just absent, like I was furniture that had always been there and no longer needed noticing. My brother sat 2 rows ahead, close to my father. Their heads leaned toward each other now and then, voices low, urgent, not grief-stricken, coordinated. My mother had been the one who kept us aligned, who softened sharp words before they landed. Without her, the room felt unbalanced, like a table missing one leg. When the service ended, no one lingered in silence the way people usually do when they've lost someone who mattered. Instead, chairs scraped. Someone cleared their throat too loudly. The sound echoed longer than it should have. My brother stood before anyone could suggest we move outside. He didn't ask for privacy. He didn't lower his voice. "There's something we need to settle," he said, hands braced against the back of the pew in front of him. "The farm's going to be sold. It's the only way to cover what's owed." A ripple moved through the room. Not outrage, calculation. He explained it cleanly, almost rehearsed. $650,000. Gambling losses. Business gone wrong. He called it unavoidable, said it had already been discussed. I waited for my father to interrupt him. He didn't. My father gave a small nod, the kind you give when a decision has already been made somewhere else. Then he looked at me, finally, and said, "You'll need to find somewhere else to live." That was it. No pause, no explanation, no invitation to respond. Something inside me cracked, not loudly, but all at once. I felt the room tilt. I saw my aunt lower her gaze. A cousin pressed her lips together as if holding back a comment she'd already decided not to make. Someone touched my arm in passing, a gesture without words, without commitment. I understood then that silence could be louder than accusation. I stepped outside before anyone could say something worse by pretending to say nothing at all. The light was harsher out there. Cars lined the gravel lot. Conversations resumed in small, careful clusters. I walked past them, my shoes crunching against stone, until the church stood behind me like a closed chapter no one planned to reopen. I drove toward the farm without thinking it through. Habit, maybe. Or hope, thin as it was. When I reached the barn, I noticed it immediately. The lock was new. Bright metal against weathered wood. Clean. Deliberate. I wrapped my fingers around the handle and pulled. It didn't budge. The door groaned softly, then settled back into place. "We changed the locks," someone said behind me. Casual. Final. I stepped back, staring at the door I'd opened 1,000 times growing up. The smell of hay still lingered in the cracks. Everything looked the same. Nothing was. That's when it hit me. This hadn't happened today. Today was just the announcement. My brother looked relieved when our eyes met. My father turned away. I stood there longer than I should have, listening to the wind move through fields that were no longer mine, and felt something settle in my chest. Not anger, not yet. Understanding. What they didn't know was that my mother never left anything unfinished. That sentence kept echoing in my head as I stood outside the locked barn longer than I care to admit. The padlock glinted in the late afternoon sun, and the silence around me stretched, unbothered by my presence. I could still hear the faint clinking of dishes from the kitchen window, the muffled rhythm of life carrying on inside, without me. No one came out. No one called my name. And that silence hurt more than anything they'd said. I turned and walked slowly toward the porch, the boards creaking beneath my boots like they remembered me, unlike the people inside. My brother was sitting at the table when I entered the kitchen, already flipping through a folder of papers like I was late for a meeting I hadn't been invited to. He didn't offer me coffee, didn't say he was sorry, just pushed the folder toward me and said, "We figured it was time to be direct." The "we" in that sentence wasn't lost on me. He launched right into it. Timelines, appraisals, offers already made. "It's not personal," he said. "It's business." We all knew this was coming. I didn't remember knowing any of it. He talked about closing dates, legal obligations, tax debts. My name never came up in any of those paragraphs. When I tried to ask who "we" meant, he waved me off like a fly. "Come on, man. You're not married. You don't have kids. You've always kind of drifted. This place is too much for you anyway." It wasn't a conversation. It was a scripted handoff. Twist S3 hit hard. I realized then that this sale wasn't just an idea sparked by desperation at the funeral. It had been cooking for months, maybe longer. My father wandered in mid-sentence and stood behind my brother like punctuation. "It's for the best," he said without looking at me. "He needs the help more than you do." He didn't even say my name, just he and you. Like I wasn't flesh and blood, but a variable in some tired equation. "You're adaptable," Dad added. "Start fresh. You'll be fine." That's when I understood. I was the extra piece in their puzzle, the spare, the one who could be sacrificed without tearing the rest apart. Twist S2 hadn't been the last blow. This was worse. This was them explaining why I was disposable and expecting me to nod along. I sat there a while after they left the room, staring at the worn place in the table where my mother used to set her teacup every morning. That groove had outlived her, and maybe outlived any real place I had in this house. Driving into town later that afternoon felt like stepping into someone else's shadow. People I'd known since childhood smiled at my brother, shook his hand outside the pharmacy. When I walked in, conversations dipped to whispers. Someone at the post office gave me a sympathetic smile and said, "Heard you're headed out soon." Out. I hadn't even packed a box, and the town had already written me off. Twist S4 wasn't a scream. It was a whisper I couldn't shut out. They'd already decided. Without me. Just like everything else. I bought a coffee and sat in my truck outside the hardware store, watching the sky turn from orange to rust. I thought about saying nothing, about just letting it all go. There was a voice in my head, mine but tired, that said, maybe this is the sign. Maybe you walk away. Maybe you finally stop trying to belong. But then, I thought of her, of how my mother used to squeeze my hand when I doubted myself, how she once told me, don't ever let people confuse your quiet with absence. So I drove back to the house, not for another argument, but for clarity. I walked up the stairs to the attic where the heat held onto old air like secrets. Dust floated in shafts of fading sunlight. I moved aside a stack of her sewing boxes and opened a trunk I hadn't touched in years. That's when I found it. I didn't open the envelope right away. I sat with it in my palm for what felt like hours, as the attic air grew heavier and the wooden beams above me creaked like old bones. The handwriting on the front was undeniably hers, sharp, clean, and deliberate. No name, no stamp, just a date. I turned it over, sealed. Back in my childhood room, the night pressed in through the windows. I closed the door behind me, the old brass knob clicking with that familiar stiffness I remembered as a kid sneaking out late. I flicked on the lamp. Its warm light cast a soft halo over the room. Same quilt folded at the end of the bed, same books lining the shelf, same framed photo of me at 17 holding a fishing rod next to Mom. My name on the trophy meant little now. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the drawer I had found slightly ajar. Why would she hide something like this? And why now? I slid my thumb under the envelope's flap and opened it with a slow rip, as if the sound might wake someone. Inside was a single sheet of stationery, creased once down the middle. Her handwriting again. All it said was, July 14th. You'll remember when the time comes. That was it. No salutation, no signature, no explanation. I reread it 3 times, expecting hidden ink to appear or a second page to flutter out. Nothing. I turned off the lamp and lay back on the bed, the envelope still resting on my chest. I didn't remember July 14th. Not yet. Sometime before dawn, I found myself sitting on the floor, back against the dresser, trying to piece together what this could mean. I thought about the way my mother used to keep everything. She had an entire file cabinet in the laundry room labeled with years and names, birth certificates, car titles, recipes from the local paper, and she never threw away correspondence, even junk mail, without reading it twice. She wasn't careless. She wasn't passive either, I was beginning to see. Her silence had always seemed like gentleness to me, but now it felt strategic. I remembered how, when we were kids, she never interrupted my father during one of his monologues, not even when he talked over her at dinner. She'd just nod, take a slow sip of tea, and let him go on. But hours later, she'd bring up one sentence he'd said, out of context, and use it like a knife to cut through his pride. Not cruelly, just precisely. That's when it hit me. She'd once insisted I come with her to a meeting across town. I was 23, home for a week between jobs. I didn't want to go. She said it was about a life policy update, and it won't take long. I sat through the whole thing half asleep in a small office with thick carpet and a woman in glasses who slid papers across the desk like we were finalizing a loan. That date, that meeting had been mid-July, and now the envelope. It was that same week. I stood up too fast, heart hammering, and knocked over the lamp. The bulb didn't break, but it sent a thud through the floor. I stayed still, listening for movement from the rest of the house, but nothing stirred. In that silence, something else settled in me. Suspicion. Not of her, but of what she knew, and what she might have planned, knowing none of them would honor her wishes. especially not after she was gone. I ran a hand through my hair and sat again on the bed, facing the envelope like it might speak. "Is this what you left me?" I whispered. "Just a sentence?" I thought about burning it, thought about folding it back up, placing it back in the drawer, and locking that room behind me for good. It would be easier. Let my brother have the farm. Let my father pretend I never mattered. But that would mean she did all this for nothing. I closed my eyes and pictured her smile, the way she'd tilt her head when she knew something no one else did. That knowing look. Soft, but solid. She didn't leave me a key. She left me a door. And that meant it was up to me to walk through it. The sun was rising by the time I stood again. Light slid between the slats of the blinds, brushing over the floor like the opening of a curtain. I placed the envelope back where I found it, just under the drawer liner, and pressed it down gently. No rush, not yet. But now I knew. If she had planned this, she hadn't done it alone. And I knew exactly who to ask. The name had been in the back of my mind all night, tapping like a loose shutter in a quiet storm. By mid-morning, I was already parked outside the county courthouse, engine cooling under the dusty heat, watching a janitor unlock the side door for the day shift. I didn't go to a lawyer, not yet. Lawyers make noise. I needed someone who didn't ask questions, just handed over facts. And there was only one person my mother ever called when she needed things to quietly be where they belonged. Miriam Keller had worked in the records office longer than I'd been alive. She knew who got married, who got buried, and who tried to hide a second mortgage before filing for divorce. If my mother had done anything official, it would have passed through Miriam's hands. The office smelled like old paper and lemon polish. Fans buzzed quietly in the corners, and the air had that slow, stale weight of a place where secrets settled. Miriam sat behind a tall counter, glasses chained around her neck, her eyes flicking up before I'd even cleared my throat. "You're Ruth's boy," she said, voice low but sure. "I heard. I'm sorry." I nodded. "Thank you." She didn't ask why I was there, just pushed aside her sandwich and gestured for me to come closer. "What do you need, sweetheart?" "I think my mom may have filed something here. Legal documents, maybe insurance, a trust, or land rights. Something with a date. July 14th, 13 years ago." She raised a brow. "That specific?" "She left me a note." Miriam didn't smile, but something softened in her expression. She reached beneath the desk, unlocked a drawer, and pulled out a thick binder. "Your mother was very careful," she said, flipping through the index. "Never rushed anything, never left things to chance." The binder creaked as she laid it flat. Her finger stopped on a line halfway down the page. There's a sealed filing under her name, dated July 14th. It's marked Private Directive, Delayed Release. That means there's a trigger attached. "Trigger?" I asked. Miriam nodded. "Usually death, sale of property, sometimes both. Until it's triggered, only the named executor or a court order can open it." "Do you know what it is?" She hesitated. "Not the contents, no. But she came in 3 times after that date to update her records. Each time, she double-checked that directive was still sealed and intact." I leaned back, absorbing it. 13 years. My mother had set something in motion when I was barely old enough to think long-term, and she'd kept it silent all this time. "You okay?" Miriam asked gently. I nodded again, but it wasn't real. Outside, the light had sharpened. The sun bore down with that flat, ruthless clarity only small towns seem to produce. I crossed the street to the diner and slid into a booth by the window. The waitress didn't recognize me. Good. I didn't want recognition. I wanted coffee and a few quiet minutes to think. The filing existed. That was real, but it wasn't actionable. Not yet. If I pushed too soon, I could jeopardize everything she'd tried to secure. The clerk had warned me without saying it outright. If I got emotional and made noise, someone could claim undue interference, and the whole thing might fall apart. I stirred cream into my coffee, staring at the spoon instead of the people walking by. I thought about keeping quiet, letting them do what they were going to do and hoping the filing would kick in after the sale. But that didn't sit right. Mom had raised me better than that. So I made a different choice. Not revenge, not yet, but a warning. That afternoon, I pulled into the farm just before sunset. The long driveway curved past the old cattle fence, now mostly decorative. I parked by the porch and got out slowly, deliberately. I wanted them to hear me coming. They were both inside. I heard my father's voice first, low and grumbling, followed by my brother's louder, more performative drawl. They stopped talking when I opened the door. "Well, look who's back," my brother said. "Thought you'd packed up." "I want 5 minutes," I said. "That's all." My father didn't move from his recliner. My brother leaned against the kitchen counter, arms crossed like he was expecting a punchline. "I just came from the courthouse," I began. "There's a filing under Mom's name. Private directive, dated 13 years ago." They said nothing. I continued. "I don't know what's in it, but it's tied to the land. If you push through this sale and that directive triggers, whatever's in it will become public record." My father's eyes narrowed. So, I'm telling you to wait." "Wait?" My brother laughed. "For what? Ghosts? You're grasping, man. This is a last grab for relevance." "I'm not threatening you," I said calmly. "I'm giving you the one thing none of you gave me. Warning." My father stood now, slow and stiff. He looked me over like a man sizing up a stranger he didn't care for. "She's gone," he said. "And whatever little seeds she planted, we'll handle. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." I didn't blink. "You mean harder for you?" He didn't answer. I left without slamming the door, but I heard them laughing as it clicked shut behind me. That was the moment I stopped trying to protect them and started preparing to end it. 2 days later, I stood in line at the local bank branch, tie loose at my throat. The weight of my father's smirk still coiled in the back of my mind. I hadn't told anyone I was coming. Not even Miriam. Not the clerk. Not the neighbor who waved politely when I pulled out of the gravel drive that morning. I didn't come to argue. I came to ask one question. The teller led me to the back, where the branch manager, an aging man with eyes that darted too quickly, shook my hand like he expected trouble. "I just need to verify one procedural clause tied to the farm's operating account," I said calmly. "It would have been set up years ago by my mother, Ruth." He nodded. "And your name, sir?" I gave it. He typed it in. His expression shifted from routine to rigid. "There's a note here, but I'll need a moment." He disappeared behind a frosted glass door, leaving me alone with the muted hum of ceiling fans and the faint scent of paper and antiseptic. I stared at the potted plant in the corner, the way its leaves drooped toward the carpet, like it had given up pretending to thrive. 5 minutes passed, then 7. He returned slower than he left, a folded sheet of paper in his hand. "I'll need to place a call," he said. "Would you be willing to wait in the conference room?" I nodded, following him down the hall to a narrow room lined with cheap wood paneling and a table too large for its purpose. I sat at one end while he dialed behind the glass wall. I couldn't hear what was said, but I saw his jaw tense. His hand moved slower over the receiver, and when he finally hung up, he didn't come back in right away. Whatever my mother filed, it worked, but it also meant I just moved from grieving son to legal obstacle. And if my brother and father were close to finalizing the sale, I had just made the terrain harder for them to cross. Good. Still, my hands trembled as I pressed my palms flat against the table. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was something more bitter, a clarity I hadn't asked for. Mercy had been mistaken for surrender. Silence had been misread as weakness. And I had played into their hands for far too long. That afternoon, I drove to the county courthouse and parked along the east side, where the shade from the oak trees bought you a few extra minutes of cool air before the Carolina heat reclaimed everything. Inside, the hallway echoed with every footstep. I sat on a wooden bench, papers in a folder tucked beneath my arm, watching clerks move past like clock hands, purposeful but unbothered. I'd done it. I had filed an objection, not to block the sale outright yet, but to flag the account as under potential legal review. It was the first move in a long game, but it was mine. And then I just sat. No audience, no applause. Just me in a hallway that had heard thousands of family betrayals before mine. For the first time, I wondered if Mom had hoped I wouldn't have to go this far. If her silence was a shield she wanted to leave behind, not a sword. But there I was, paperwork filed, decisions made, and all I could feel was the cold knot of grief reshaping itself into something more permanent, something with edges. That night, I returned to the farmhouse, no lights on. The windows stared out like hollow eyes. I didn't go in, just stood by the porch steps, phone in hand, unsure if I was about to find more weight or relief. A message buzzed. From someone inside the bank. Simple, clinical. Purchase contract expedited. Final signatures set for Friday. They were moving faster because they felt pressure. They were trying to finish before I found the rest of the truth. And now there was no more space to wait. No more time to be still. If they wanted a race, I was done walking. I was ready to run. By the time the courthouse doors opened that morning, my hands had already stopped shaking, not because I felt peace, but because something inside me had calcified. If the sale moving forward confirmed anything, it was this. Mercy was useless now. I wasn't thinking like a son anymore. I was thinking like a strategist. Inside the clerk's office, I filed a procedural motion my mother once described in passing, half warning, half gift, on a day I barely remembered until now. It wasn't a lawsuit, not even an objection. It was quieter than that, technical, surgical. It required the buyer's legal team to disclose the full farm asset history. It forced a 72-hour delay in escrow review. It turned something simple into something uncertain. And in the world of rural land deals, uncertainty was poison. I handed the documents to the clerk and watched her lips press together as she read. No reaction, no small talk, just the soft thump of her stamp on the corner of the page. "Anything else?" she asked. "No," I said. "That'll do." Walking out of the courthouse felt less like leaving and more like stepping into a new role, one I hadn't wanted, but one I now carried like armor. Halfway to my truck, my phone rang. I almost let it go to voicemail, but some part of me wanted to hear his voice crack. It was my brother. "What the hell did you just do?" I didn't answer. "Don't play dumb. You think this is going to stop anything? All you did was make yourself look desperate." Still, I said nothing. The silence stretched long enough to make him uncomfortable. "Fine," he snapped. "If you want war, you got it." He hung up, and for the first time since this all began, I smiled. Not because I enjoyed any of this, but because for once. He sounded scared. Later that afternoon, as the sun fell behind the courthouse roofline, I lingered by the back lot where the trees grew tall enough to swallow sound. I was headed to my truck when I heard footsteps, measured, deliberate. My father. He didn't greet me, didn't ask how I was. Just stepped close enough that I could smell the tobacco on his jacket. "You really think you're gonna come out on top of this?" he said, low and steady. I didn't respond. He shifted his weight, jaw tight. "You think dragging this out is going to earn you respect? You're embarrassing yourself." Still, I said nothing. He leaned in closer. "You pull one more stunt, and I swear to God, you'll regret it. You think you've been cut out now? Just wait." That was it. That was the moment. I looked him in the eye and said 2 words. Calm, clean. No more. Then I walked past him like he didn't weigh a thing. By the time I got back on the road, the light had turned honey-colored, the fields to my left glowing like they were on fire. But I didn't feel any warmth. I just drove. Headlights cut the early dark as I passed the edge of our property. The house sat in the distance like a monument, silent, watching, indifferent. I didn't slow, didn't glance toward the barn. I just kept going until my phone buzzed again. It was a message from an old friend in town. "Thought you should know. They just brought in outside counsel. Big firm from Charlotte. Not cheap, not subtle." I stared at the screen. So that was their next move. Hire the kind of legal team that didn't just fight you in court. They fought you in reputation, in rumor, in the kind of aggressive letters meant to break your will before a judge ever heard your name. It wasn't about the land anymore. It was about erasing me. They weren't just trying to sell the farm. They were trying to make sure I never touched anything tied to our name again. And that was the line. The one they crossed without hesitation. They thought they'd scared me into silence. What they'd really done was wake me up. The first hit didn't come with a phone call or a confrontation. It came in a white envelope, standard size, polite typeface, no return address, slid under my door sometime before dawn. A formal reply to my motion, not just a counter-argument, but a full petition to dismiss. I read it 3 times, slower each time, not for the legal jargon, but for the tone behind it. Every sentence dripped with civility and venom. The second hit came when my calls to Aunt Nadine and Uncle Wes went to voicemail and stayed there. Nadine, who once held my hand when I fell off the swing. Wes, who taught me how to change a tire. Ghosted. Just like that. A week ago, they were asking how I was holding up. Now, silence. By the time I walked into the local diner that morning, same place we'd all shared pancakes after church growing up, I could feel the shift. Heads didn't turn. Conversations didn't pause. But no one looked at me either. That, I've learned, is its own kind of scream. At the register, the cashier, young, polite, cleared her throat. Sorry, sir. I think your card's not going through." I blinked. "That's impossible." She tried again. Still nothing. A half-second later, my phone buzzed with a fraud alert. Your credit line has been temporarily frozen pending review. I left a 20 on the counter and walked out. They were going after my money now. Back in my truck, I called the bank. After 5 menu options and 8 minutes on hold, someone finally picked up. Yes, Mr. Larkin. It appears there's been a temporary hold on your line of credit due to unusual legal activity tied to one of the assets under your name. What legal activity? I'm afraid I'm not authorized to disclose the specifics. Of course not. By noon, I had a certified letter from a local firm, one I didn't recognize, but big enough that they didn't list a phone number, just a switchboard. The letter was direct. Cease all legal interference or be subject to a countersuit for malicious obstruction and emotional damages. At the bottom was my brother's signature. He didn't call me. He didn't even text. He let the envelope speak. I drove aimlessly for a while, not thinking about where, just circling the edges of town like a dog kicked from its own porch. I passed the family farm twice, never slowing down. I wasn't ready to look it in the eye yet. At 3:14 p.m., another message landed. You have 72 hours to drop everything. This is your final opportunity to avoid litigation and further consequences. Counsel for Daniel and Richard Larkin. Why? I sat in the parking lot outside the courthouse for nearly an hour. No radio, no movement, just the soft creak of the cooling engine. At one point, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. I looked like my father. That thought almost broke me. I drove toward the farm, not to confront, not to yell, just to be near what still felt like her. Mom's rose bushes by the fence, the lopsided wind chime that never quite played a tune. I pulled over near the edge of the field and sat on the tailgate, watching the golden light stretch long across the soil she once walked. And for the first time in this whole mess, I considered letting it all go. Not because they were right, but because I was tired. Tired in my bones. Tired of fighting people who once tucked me in at night. Tired of trying to defend a name they'd already stripped bare. The sun dipped lower, the sky bruising purple. Crickets stirred. The air changed. I climbed back into the truck, intending to drive home and call it a night. But on a whim, I turned instead toward the town hall. The building was closed, but I had a key, Mom's old access from her time volunteering with the records committee. They'd never changed the lock. Inside, it smelled like dust and copier toner. I found her filing drawer, opened it without a plan. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just something that felt like her. And that's when I saw it. A yellowed envelope marked only with my initials. Inside was a copy of the deed from 2003, with an amendment I'd never seen before. A clause, a trigger, something dormant, until now. My breath caught. She hadn't left me defenseless. She'd just taught me to wait. I folded the document gently, like it was made of breath, not paper, and slid it back into its envelope. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't need to. Some truths, once found, keep you wide awake. By 7:42 the next morning, I was already parked in front of the courthouse, watching the windows light up one by one. It was a neutral-looking building, gray brick, rectangular windows, a flag that barely moved in the wind. But today, it felt like a reckoning wrapped in concrete. Inside, the hearing room was just as sterile as I remembered it. Fluorescent lights, scuffed linoleum floor, beige walls that had soaked in decades of quiet battles. It was early, and the chairs were mostly empty. I sat alone in the second row, hands on my knees, back straight, breathing evenly. They arrived 15 minutes later. My father led the way in his best pressed shirt, still carrying himself like the head of something. My brother followed, looking rehearsed but slightly pale. Behind them came two attorneys, each clutching a briefcase and wearing the faint smirk of men who thought they'd already won. They didn't look at me. That was fine. A bailiff called the room to order. The judge entered, an older woman with a calm voice and a sharper stare. As she opened the file in front of her, my brother stood, cleared his throat, and launched into the story we'd all heard before. He spoke with confidence about timelines, about debt, about shared sacrifice, and the need to honor the family's legacy through responsible stewardship. He spoke of me, too, gently at first, then not so gently. My brother is grieving, understandably so, but he's made choices lately that suggest he may not be acting with full clarity. We believe it's in the estate's best interest to move forward without obstruction. He said the word obstruction like it was a stain. My father nodded behind him, jaw tight. The attorneys sat still, expressions blank but eyes hungry. The judge turned to me. "Do you wish to respond, Mr. Larkin?" I stood. "No speeches," I said quietly. "Just documents." The clerk approached and I handed her the sealed envelope, the same one my mother had tucked away 13 years ago. The judge opened it, brows knitting slightly as she flipped through the pages. Then she looked up. "Mr. Larkin, is this your mother's handwriting?" "Yes, ma'am. Filed with the records office in 2010. Updated in 2016. Quietly. Deliberately." The room shifted, not loudly, but undeniably. The judge turned back to the paperwork, reading aloud. "In the event of my death, any attempt to sell the property without the unanimous written consent of all named beneficiaries shall be deemed invalid. Furthermore, should a majority attempt to override this clause, the designated minority shall be granted sole stewardship authority until such time as all parties agree to fair mediation." The attorneys began to whisper. My brother leaned forward, color draining from his cheeks. My father narrowed his eyes but stayed seated. "And," the judge continued, "the named minority, based on this document, is you, Mr. Larkin?" "Yes, ma'am." "This clause, it was notarized?" "By her church elder, the same man who baptized her. He passed last year, but the records are intact." The room fell into silence that buzzed louder than any argument. My brother opened his mouth, then closed it again. His lawyer fumbled with papers, trying to regain footing, but the trap had already been sprung, not by anger, not by revenge, but by forethought. My mother hadn't tried to stop a war. She'd simply built a fence no one had seen coming. The judge cleared her throat and laid the papers flat. "The court recognizes this clause as valid. Any sale of the property conducted in violation of this provision shall be immediately nullified. Furthermore, the transfer of authority, as defined here, is now in effect." My father didn't react at first, but then he lowered his head. Not in shame, not in surrender, but in something like quiet defeat, a recognition. My brother finally looked at me, and for the first time, there was no fire in his eyes, no performance, just the slack-jawed stillness of a man watching something he thought was his slip through his fingers. No one applauded, no one cried. Even the judge didn't smile. She just gavelled once and said, "This hearing is concluded." People filtered out slowly, unsure if they were supposed to speak or stay silent. The air felt thicker, like everyone was walking through fog. I stayed seated for a moment, staring at the floor, letting the silence wrap around me, not like a punishment this time, but a reprieve. And when I finally stood, I didn't look back at them. I didn't have to. As the room emptied, I realized winning didn't feel like revenge. It felt like being allowed to breathe again. The courthouse emptied behind me like a sigh that had waited too long to be released. No one stopped to shake my hand, no backpats, no, you did the right thing. Just shoes on linoleum and doors that didn't quite close all the way. And I didn't need any of it. I didn't walk fast. I didn't check my phone. The sky was low with autumn haze as I crossed the street toward my truck, the kind of sky that made things look softer even if nothing had changed. Breathing again didn't mean the air was warm. It just meant I wasn't drowning anymore. I didn't drive to the house. Instead, I pulled up to the edge of the farm, the property line where the cornrows once started before we sold off the North Acre, back when things were still wee. The engine ticked as it cooled, and I sat with the window down, letting the wind thread through the cab. The smell of dry earth and distant diesel brought back summers that had nothing to do with courtrooms. I didn't go in. The land didn't belong to me, not in the way people think about deeds or titles, not even now, after the hearing. It was never really about owning the dirt. It was about what they'd tried to erase and what refused to be buried. By the fence, the old blue ribbon was still tied to the lowest post, frayed, sun-bleached, barely holding together. My mother tied it there when I was 15, after I won the county science fair. She said it reminded her where I started. My father told her to cut it down. She never did. I reached for it through the open window but didn't take it. It didn't need a new place. It just needed to stay right where it was. That's when it hit me, how quiet everything had become. Not just the field or the house. Inside me, too. The storm that had kept my chest tight for weeks, it had passed. But in its place wasn't peace. It was weight, not a burden. Just truth. Winning hadn't fixed anything. My father wouldn't call. My brother wouldn't apologize. They'd retreat, lick their wounds, tell themselves a version of the story they could live with. That I was ungrateful, that I made things worse, that the past was complicated. They'd find ways to justify what they'd done. And maybe I would have done the same if I hadn't seen it written down in black and white. My mother's name, her intent, her plan tucked into a file 13 years old and perfectly timed. She hadn't needed anyone's permission to act. She just needed me to wait long enough to see what silence could build if you refused to break. I stayed parked at the fence for a long time, until the sun dropped low enough to paint the tops of the trees in burnt orange. A few cars passed, but no one stopped. I guess the sight of a man in a truck near a farm doesn't raise alarms in these parts. People are used to men sitting alone with thoughts they'll never share. Eventually, I turned the key and headed down the gravel path, not toward the courthouse, not back to the empty house, but out of town. Not far, just enough. I stopped at a diner 5 miles east, the kind with faded booths and a waitress who called you Han without thinking twice. I ordered black coffee and a slice of apple pie I didn't touch. The place was nearly empty. A kid in a hoodie read a textbook in the corner. A trucker scrolled his phone near the window. No one looked at me like they knew my name. It felt good. Across from me, the empty seat didn't feel so empty anymore. It felt earned. I pulled a folded paper from my pocket. Not the court's decision, but something older. My mother's handwriting, soft at the edges now. A note I hadn't shown anyone. If they forget your worth, Don't argue. Just remember I never did. That was all it said. I folded it back along the creases and slid it into my wallet behind my license. Not to carry as proof, just to know it was there. The truth is, I'll probably never farm that land. I don't know if I'll sell it. Maybe I'll lease it to someone young, like I once was. Maybe I'll let it sit until the soil forgets the fights and remembers how to grow something again. But I won't let it be a battlefield again. Justice came in paper and silence. No fireworks, no catharsis. Just a door that stayed open long enough for the right document to walk through. And when I left that diner, the world didn't look brighter, but it didn't look small anymore either. I didn't go back to the house. I didn't need to. Some endings don't need a curtain to fall. They just need you to stop holding your breath. Because some wounds don't close, but they stop bleeding the moment you stop letting others decide what you're worth.